Professor Curley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, your research focuses on the everyday incorporation of indigenous nations into colonial economies. What are some examples of this?
Well, my initial research project as a graduate student, I think, was the main example that I had in mind at that time, although there's many other examples, but it was the coal economy in the Navajo Nation, which started in the 1960s, at least in an industrial scale, and has come to an end in many parts of the reservation over the last few years. And so it's thinking about the ramifications of that type of economy, that participation in extractive industries, in coal in particular, the kind of work and labor involved, the kind of revenues generated for the tribal government, and then, of course, the environmental consequences of that type of work. And those are the things that are part of the colonial economies that surround Indian country and incorporate large parts of our lands into the service of other things. So when we think about coal, a lot of the energy produced, in fact, all of the energy produced was going toward outside communities and going towards specific types of projects. In this case, with the Kayenta mine and the Navajo generating station, the coal was going toward, the energy produced by coal was going towards the Central Arizona Project, the making of this water infrastructure in Arizona. But other parts of the economy, the Navajo mine on the eastern end of the reservation, in what is part of New Mexico, that's going towards. I think even PNM has some utility stake in these power plants, so that's going towards the places where PNM serves. So all of this is to say the kinds of economic activities generated in the reservation and which were structured through a lot of long-term policies from the federal government, partnership with state officials, especially in the 1930s. These economies are geared toward outside interests, and especially other communities, settler communities outside of the reservation. So that's kind of my general idea of what colonial economies are.
Yeah, it's when we kind of look at the extraction of coal or fossil fuels or whatever, uranium from indigenous communities and look at how they have fueled entire economies. Is that kind of what you're looking at?
Yeah, going even back further to uranium industry. I mean, the kinds of economies that are built out of the colonial experience are often state run and state funded, such as what was happening with uranium in the 40s and 50s with the Navajo Nation. And much of the market for uranium was coming from, I think it was the Atomic Energy Commission, or it was an entity of the federal government who was trying to build up a uranium supply for its own nuclear purposes at the time, and that created the demand for that kind of resource, which was found to be in abundance in the Navajo Nation through the Grants Uranium Belt or Mineral Belt. And so those are the kinds of relationships that develop in this particular kind of economic formation, which is, you have very strict restrictions coming out of the federal Indian law, coming out of the federal government's long-term policy with tribes. Some of these laws have justifications going back to the 1830s. That's, the idea of domestic dependent, the idea of plenary power, which is a theory that develops in the later 19th century, which gives Congress complete control over anything that happens on reservations. All of these things are types of restrictions around tribal governments, which don't exist for the state governments, don't exist for counties, don't exist for other international actors. And so you have this stranglehold over what are the possibilities politically for what tribal governments can do. And at the same time, there are incentives built into the to this policy, like the 1937 Indian Mineral Leasing Act that was coming out of the New Deal reforms of the Roosevelt administration that created the legal basis for long-term mineral leasing between tribal governments and outside entities, which explains the development and long-standing practice of extractive industries in many indigenous nations throughout the western part of North America. So that's that is the way that the political legal regime of colonialism structures what is possible and what is not possible for tribal economies, for tribal governments. We couldn't float our own currency if we wanted to. We couldn't make trade agreements with Mexico independent of any kind of authority of the United States. Those kinds of agreements, which other nations enjoy, are restricted for tribal nations. But we can do coal mining, we can do uranium mining, we can do gas and oil exploration. So that gives you a sense of how these economies develop over time.
Yeah, so you also have written about the intersection of Indian water settlements and COVID, and why, like, say, for example, the Navajo Nation still lacks water infrastructure here in the 21st century. Can you explain that intersection a little bit?
Yes. During the height of the pandemic in 2020 and then even into 2021, we were thinking through what are the reasons for high transmission rates in the Navajo Nation, and there's a few factors involved. And one of the key suspects was lack of indoor plumbing for many of the households throughout the reservation. Lack of indoor plumbing, which allows for people to wash their hands or to clean dishes or things that will help to sanitize their experience, and try to stay safe among the people in the household. And when we're thinking about the lack of water in people's homes and what are the reasons for that, part of the argument that I was trying to make, part of the connections that I was trying to make, was tied to long-standing delays in our water settlement process, and that is, I mean, it's hard to explain quickly, but it's to say, after the Colorado Basin states divided the entirety of the Colorado River amongst themselves and its tributaries, excluding all indigenous considerations in the making of the Colorado Compact in 1922, 100 years ago, almost to this day. And they what ended up happening was water rights, access to water, either in the form of access to the water from the tributaries or access to water from the main stem of the Colorado River. These things required some sort of legal political process in order for you to build infrastructure and divert water into the places where you need it, either for agriculture or for household security purposes. So this is a long-standing issue that we've been dealing with for quite some time, since the late 70s. And when we started to settle some of our water claims, like the 2005 San Juan River settlement between the Navajo Nation and the state of New Mexico, we were initially able to secure some water infrastructure going toward Window Rock, Fort Defiance, St. Michael's, one of the larger population centers in the Navajo Nation. And what we were going to do was we were going to move a little more than 7,000 acre feet of water from the Gallup supply line into that Window Rock, Fort Defiance area. And that was something that we agreed to with the state of New Mexico at that time, and New Mexico was okay with it because it kind of violated some arbitrary political lines dealing with the Colorado Compact. Again, I'm sorry, this is a little bit like, it gets a little bit historical and technical in weird ways, but what ends up with when you cross the state boundary, you're moving between basins, and at least the way the basins are divided, I didn't bring a map, I'm sorry, but it goes the San Juan River, and the water coming through the Gallup supply line is coming from upper basin, and then when you move it into Window Rock and Fort Defiance, you're moving it into the lower basin. And because of how coveted the water is and how political the basin fights are between upper and lower basins, like moving water across basins is really hard to do, but we were able to secure it. The recipient on the recipient side, it was the state of Arizona who denied that, with John Kyle, who was representing, a lower basin state receiving water ostensibly through this settlement. And he was saying, we're not going to give water to the Navajo Nation until they settle all of their claims with the state of Arizona. A really adversarial approach to getting water to the Navajo Nation. And so when we look back at the record of John Kyle as a senator for Arizona, he was an obstructionist to any kind of water infrastructure that we could have put forward in the Navajo Nation. And this was happening in around the 2005, 2010, 2012 era when we were approaching the state of Arizona, negotiating settlements and agreeing to settlements. The Navajo Nation Council and the Hopi Tribal Council agreed to a settlement for the lower basin waters, both the Colorado River and the Little Colorado River, all in one settlement in 2010, so 12 years ago. And one of the things that we wanted in exchange for settling what our claims are to the water and putting it into a more predictable accountability for the state and also for the tribe was we wanted some guarantees of money for infrastructure. That's the main thing we were asking for, especially on the western end of the reservation. And we wanted something like the Gallup supply line on the western end. And Kyle said, no, that's too expensive. It doesn't serve enough people. It's not an interest of his to take that to Congress and put a price tag on it. And so pretty much vetoed that settlement, prevented it from getting from becoming law through an act by bringing it in as a legislation in Congress. And so that just died. That agreement died, and then they tried it again in 2012, and that didn't go through. And again at 2012, in 2012, we're asking for water infrastructure. So all of these, during these times, 10 and 12 years ago, we've been asking for this water infrastructure. We were willing to negotiate down our water claims in order to just get that infrastructure to bring water to the households, especially on the western end of the reservation, which are more remote and have lesser rates of water access. I mean, where you have the high rates of lack of water are in the central area and in the western area. And so that's, for the Navajo Nation, for the councils at the time, that was a prime importance. And that was something that, because of the state of Arizona's power, the authority they have to bring these settlements into law, as with the representatives in Congress and also with the senators, having that final authority and say, they ended up denying that kind of infrastructure, that would have played a positive role when we come into 2020 and into 2021 during the COVID outbreak and the high transmission rates, right? We didn't have a lot of that infrastructure, in large part due to the shenanigans on the other end with the senator from Arizona.
Yeah, and these sort of historical and legal implications really play out for people on the ground. I wanted to talk with you a little bit more about the Colorado River, which is basically, in crisis mode right now for cities and irrigation districts. There's more of a demand for water than there is a supply right now. You've written extensively about the Central Arizona Project, and I heard you speak recently about scarcity and how we don't talk enough about how dams and reservoirs are what you called the concrete manifestations of colonialist ambitions, and how they contribute to drought and to this narrative of drought and narrative of crisis. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's the flip side of the problem that I was just talking about with the infrastructure on the Navajo Nation. When Boulder Canyon Act was passed, when the Hoover Dam was constructed, there's all this mythology and lore about the construction of these infrastructures, and then eventually Glen Canyon Dam, Parker Dam, the Central Arizona Project, all of these dams along the lower basin part of the Colorado River. These dams, we weren't asking questions about, oh, this is too expensive, this is not serving enough people. It was all of us future oriented ideology, like, oh, we need to create cap in order for Phoenix to grow. We need to build these dams in order for the Southwest to blossom. And the problem with, obviously there's a different standard being applied when you're talking about where you're talking about infrastructures that serve white communities as opposed to infrastructures that serve native communities. And you can guess what the reason is for those double standards. And so when you're thinking about things like the Hoover Dam, when you're thinking about things like CAP, and you're thinking about the crisis we're in now, and the drought and the effects of climate change on the Colorado River, that's something like, when you introduce this question, you said the river is in crisis for X amount of people, water districts, these people, all of these people who have been benefiting from these colonial diversions for quite some time. And if you take it from an indigenous perspective, if you take it from a Navajo perspective, a Dade perspective, or Hopi perspective, you're going to see that river's been in crisis for quite some time, going back to these first incursions into the region, going back to the construction of the Roosevelt Dam along the Salt River. Once the colonialists came in and started to dam the river and change the ecology, that's when the river started to go into crisis. That's kind of the origin of climate change in the region. It did affect the climate, it affected the river, it affected the ecologies of the region. That's exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change. So we can't divorce these infrastructures from the consideration of climate change. And so in the presentation, I show actually that's what we include these infrastructures when we're thinking about the effects of climate change. We look at reservoir levels and we say, oh, look, there's climate change here because the reservoirs are sinking. Well, those reservoirs are those colonial intrusions in the first place. They're not natural. They're not meant. The river was never meant to sit the way it does behind the walls of these dams. And so that itself is the origin of the problem beyond this larger question of declining snowpack or faster melting snowpack or prolonged drought in the region. I mean, those things are also important, but what we're not considering are the effects of these dams. They make the water sit there. They have evaporation rates. They are inefficient ways of getting water, but that's because they work at a scale. They work in a form of planning and modernization that made sense to people, to colonialists in the early 20th century, but are looking very problematic and very unsustainable moving as we get closer to the midpoint of the 21st century. So that was kind of the point I was trying to make, is like, you look at even how we talk about climate change. We talk about the Colorado River and it being endangered, and it was like, and when the origin point of that endangerment begins in most people's mind is fairly recently, and it doesn't go back to the Colorado Compact. I feel arguably the Colorado Compact has had more impact on the Colorado River than the effects of climate change thus far. And so why aren't we talking about that?
Yeah, and it's sort of talking about these myths and these different narratives. When we talk about climate change, kind of across the news media, and there's a lot of doom or talk about apocalypse, and you and many others point out that that's really a Eurocentric narrative around nature and around climate catastrophe. What does that miss out on? What is that lacking? How could that be different? How is that different?
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because I was just on another call earlier today about apocalypse, and these apocalypse narratives are pretty prevalent now. And I don't know, I think they're trying to serve as some sort of motivating factor to get people engaged in climate change activism, or they're just people predicting the end of the world. But the what like you said, I'm not the first one to come up with this point. Many other indigenous scholars and environmental historians even have talked about how how the way we understand time and progress and future catastrophe, um, it is neglecting what is the experience of indigenous nations, what is the experience of people on the ground or people that are sucked up into these systems when worlds end. You know, there are these world-ending experiences for people that have already happened, and so you're thinking about apocalypse, and your imagination is imagining the end of the world for a certain group of people, and usually they're suburban or affluent or city people or politicians, or I don't know what is in the minds of people when they're talking about this apocalypse in the future, or the danger of of the rivers. But what ends up being neglected is kind of these past intrusions. And so when you're talking about the damming up of like the Missouri River, right, with the Pixlona Acts and the flooding of hundreds of acres of indigenous land that was guaranteed through treaty, that is a world-changing experience. That is an apocalypse of sorts. And when you're talking about the building of these dams along the Navajo Nation and the land swaps involved in order to get Lake Powell, and to still maintain a land base in the Navajo Nation, these are apocalyptic scenarios, and often they happen with dams and with the way we treat water in the West. We've created these huge and world-changing infrastructures throughout the region that have also contributed to the changing of the landscape, the urban landscape. Even going through Phoenix or Albuquerque or Santa Fe over the last few years, you see cities growing and growing and growing, made possible by these infrastructures. So the worlds are always changing around us, and what is missed by this fear of what's happening at the end of the world due to climate changes is really the kind of innovative, both social, political, and cultural strategies that Indigenous people have had and have been made to have in order to survive across all of these apocalyptic events. We've dealt with all sorts of all sorts of worst case scenarios. Even being moved physically off of our land at the end of a bayonet onto in Huelde, into Bosque Redondo on the eastern end of New Mexico. That's between 1862 and 1868. That is an apocalypse moment for us, and we survived that, and we overcame that, and we made a new world in the Navajo Nation after that. And so there's a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples' ability to respond to these catastrophes and to think about what are the values of a society that has had to overcome all these marginalizations and yet continue to survive, and compare that to the values of a society that are causing those problems, that are causing these catastrophes to occur in the first place. And then maybe rather than thinking about technical solutions, we think of political and ethical solutions, right? We think about how we treat the planet ethically first before we think about things technically. And I think that gears us in a totally different direction than if we continue to have this modernist and Eurocentric idea of time, of progress and technical innovation. And we have crisis, and the solution to those crises is more technology, improved technology. When we're thinking along those lines, we end up um, not only creating more problems because you have to create new kinds of industries to serve these new ones, we perpetuate existing inequalities. The maker of one of the most innovative EVs, the Tesla Corporation, right? One of the owners is now somebody who's seen as a problematic figure in media ownership with the acquisition of Twitter. All of these things are kind of connected, really. And when we're valuing EVs and technological innovation over over social directionality and what are the values of the society, then we're not looking at other kinds of solutions. How do we work on social, political, and economic inequalities at the same time while we're dealing with things that are seen to be in the realm of the environment, environmental crises? And I think that is kind of the larger, more, I guess, philosophical question that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about these ideas of apocalypse. So I'm sorry, that's a really long-winded answer, and it feels like it's leaving with this kind of vague idea of what to do in people's minds. But that's basically where I'm at with how we were thinking about these things. Me and other people who have been writing about this.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Curley. I really appreciate it, and it's exciting to be having more and more of these conversations. I think kind of dismantling these myths and narratives of the Western United States that really just don't, I think, serve us anymore. So thank you for your work.
Yes, you're welcome. I can keep talking. No, I'm just kidding. Let's talk about your streets in Albuquerque. Gold, lead, coal. What is in the narrative that's being served by those street names? Okay, I'll stop talking.
Thank you, Professor Curley.
All right, talk to you later. Bye.
Thanks.